Good evening all. My name is James Lawrenson and I am the Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute here at UTS. Before we begin proceedings, and on behalf of all those present, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands the beautiful city UTS campus stands. I'd like to pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledging them as the custodians of knowledge for this land. Welcome, especially to our special guests tonight, Cheng and Nick Coyle. As well as our invited guests in the room and several hundred people joining us online. It's wonderful to have you with us this evening. Look, my academic home is the study of the Chinese economy. In the last decade, I've spent looking at the Australia-China economic and broader relationship, observing the ups and downs in the official relationship, as well as the extraordinary resilience of the non-government side of the relationship, business-to-business relationships and people-to-people ties. But look, that's been from the perspective of a researcher and a sometimes commentator. Well, tonight's guests have done their fair share of researching and commentating and reporting as well, but they've also lived the bilateral relationship in a way that someone like and I guess most of the people in the room, have not lived it, experienced it deep in their bones. So I'm very grateful for you both joining us and sharing your thoughts with us tonight. I'll keep their bios brief. Cheng is a Chinese-Australian journalist who worked in China and Singapore for 18 years, including with major American and Chinese media outlets such as CNBC and CGTN. In August 2020, she was detained by China's Ministry of State Security on espionage charges and held for 3 years and 2 months. She was finally released in October last year, and since then has been rebuilding her life in Melbourne. She now works as an anchor and presenter for Sky News Australia. Li, great to have you with us tonight. Thank you for coming. Li, I also notice you're an alumni of the University of Queensland, as am I, and in fact, we were there at the same time. Because I see you started your commerce degree in 1992. I started my economics degree in 1991. So you and I probably crossed each other's paths in the great, yeah, that's right, in the great court several times. All right, Nick Coyle was the long-standing CEO of Auschem in China, based in Beijing, the Australian Chamber of Commerce. I should lay out the full name, in Beijing, from 2013 to 2021. And in total, Nick, you spent 14 years in China. I think that pretty much qualifies you as a local. Now, look, in 2020, Nick took on the role of leading the advocacy for Cheng Lei's release. These days, Nick is back where he grew up, in PNG. And Nick, I see you are leading 2 businesses, one in health, one in renewable energy. So once you're a business person, we just can't get you out of the business space. Welcome, Nick. Great to have you with us. Let me now hand proceedings over to my friend and colleague, Glenda Corporal. Glenda's an adjunct fellow with us here at UTS ACRI and also a well-known journalist. You would all know her at the Australian newspaper. Glenda has her own long association with China, including as serving as the Australian's China correspondent in 2018 and 2019 when Li and Nick were both there in Brisbane. So the 3 of these folks were all in Beijing together at the same time. Nowadays, I can't think of a journalist who more consistently and more deeply reports on Australia-China business and economic relations than Glenda. So Glenda, thank you for joining us tonight. It's great to have you with us. Glenda will be in conversation with Li and Nick for a time, and then following that, there will be hopefully plenty of time for questions from our audience tonight, and also for those of you online. For those of you online, can I just remind you, please send in your questions using the Q&A tab on the screen in front of you in the Zoom app. Okay, Glenda, it's over to you.
Thank you very much for coming, and we've been trying to get Lei to come and be involved in an event at ACRI for some time, and then it was her that suggested that the event be with you and Nick. And of course, I knew Nick quite well as the Australians correspondent in China, with my own interest in business. And in fact, when I moved up to China in 2018, I went to a function and met Nick there, and my husband and I said, "Oh, let's have dinner." And he did spend a lot of time talking about you and how wonderful you were and how I should pay attention to who you were. Now, perhaps we can say, just to set the scene, how did you two meet? How did you both become to be in China at the same time? Start with you, Leigh.
Well, I had always wanted to work in China because I felt it was growing and so interesting, and I wanted to use my bilingual advantage. So when I was seconded as an expat to China in 2000, at the end of year 2000, I discovered the wonderful world called Australian Chinese joint ventures, where the Australian company held a minority share, where the easily impressed CEO had gone over to China and been wooed by these banquets and signed a contract that promised 30 years of annual returns at 30% and believed it. To cut a long story short, it was a year of starting the joint venture and then trying to end the joint venture for the Australian company. But that really ignited my China lust, if you like, and I had wanted to be a journalist. So I became an intern at then CCTV 9, which is the English arm, at the start of 2002 in February. In March, I was made a reporter, and in May, they gave me a 15-minute weekly show to host. So that sort of career trajectory, it was only back then. And in 2003, I was approached by CNBC, and of course, they're the world's biggest business TV channel. So I jumped at the chance to be more professional and spent 9 years covering China's meteoric rise. And after that, having had children, I moved to Beijing from Singapore to work at what from CCTV 9 became then CCTV News, and then now it's called CGTN, but it's all just the English arm of the state broadcaster. And that was partly because I wanted to, I guess I was grateful that they gave me my start in TV journalism, and I wanted to make it more professional, armed with my 9 years experience. And up until my arrest, I felt I had the best job in the world because I got to explain China to the rest of the world and also the other way around. And how I met Nick was at an OSCHAM function. And in fact, those couple of years were probably the highlight of the relationship, where we had a lot of visits and I got to interview all the visiting ministers and really felt, and of course, my good friend Jeff often gave me lots of insights about the bilateral relationship, and just felt that things were improving all the time until they didn't.
Yes.
But yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, I think it was a first family of wine dinner. That was when we first met. So, well, if you know, there's some good wineries there. So, at Michelle Garneau's old restaurant, Capital M in Beijing. So that's when we first met. I think we'd crossed paths briefly beforehand, but hadn't chatted much. And then, I guess got to know each other better and better over the next few months. Yeah.
so say 2019, 2020, what was it like in China then? What did you think of the Australia-China relationship? And also, what was your view of China then? Was it obviously under the ruling of Xi Jinping, but was it sort of, successful economy making its way in the world?
Well, from a journalistic point of view, we felt things were getting tighter from, say, 2015 onwards. And from a bilateral point of view, the visits were less frequent until the very last event I did for Auscham and also the embassy was in July of 2020, where one of the online questions was, you are now advising Australian citizens working and studying in China to be prepared for, to be detained. And is that likely? Should we be getting out of China, Ambassador? This is to Ambassador Graham Fletcher. And, sitting in detention for 1,184 days, I just kept thinking of that question and how eerie it was 1 month before my arrest.
Yeah, and I think Glenda, by the time sort of 2019 came along, certainly from a business perspective, the rot had already set in well and truly by then. At a political level, there was certainly tension. The embassy at that time was really struggling to meet their counterparts in the Chinese system. And yeah, business was pretty pessimistic. We certainly didn't see much new business coming in. Businesses that were already established and had their business, if you like, were still there and doing okay. But yeah, it by then it certainly slowed down. That's for sure. And politically, it was tough. Yeah.
So obviously, we want to get we want to talk about quite a few issues, many issues, but can we just go back to what from, as you said, you thought you had the best job in the world, you thought you knew how to navigate the media and the life in China, and then you didn't. What can you take us back to that time when your life changed?
Well, going from CNBC to CGTN, I was quite ambitious. I wanted CGTN to look better. I wanted it to be more professional. I wanted it to be more hard-hitting and to be more watchable. And I went to work every day with that goal in mind. It was very difficult, especially after, I guess, 2015. There were all sorts of silly restrictions. One of the funniest was when the 7 o'clock Mandarin News presenter Li Qiang had probably worn a pair of funny earrings, which someone didn't like. And then out came the edict, nobody shall wear earrings at CCTV. The entire 16 channels, 20,000 on air, that is. It has 20,000 employees, but not all of them on air. And it's that sort of thing. And also, as at the same time that China was spending billions of dollars to fund CGTN, all of the other channels have to use advertising or other ways to break even. But CGTN had its own funding from the propaganda department. And there was a global push, setting up that the DC bureau was running, and then they were setting up the London bureau, and they had all these correspondents around the world. And some of the news was quite good, I felt. It did have probably a more balanced mix of global news than some of the other privately funded channels around the world, but it was also trying to always, for example, put Xi in the headlines, which I would secretly delete. And yeah, I felt that being there, and I think on the first Q&A show ever filmed in Shanghai, Jeff and I were on this panel, and there was someone from the audience asking, why are you working for this state media organization? And I've answered honestly, I thought I was affecting change from within. And I thought being able to explain how global viewers would see things to my Chinese producers, being able to sound, more credible, I felt I was doing a good thing. And given my experience at CNBC and going to international conferences, I would always try to get more contacts for the show, better guests who had wide-ranging views, rather than the usual on the Chinese guest bookers roster.
Well, I'll add to that too, that I think if I look at the media landscape in China back then, like when I first started doing Chinese media back in sort of 13, 14, that sort of period, I mean, I guess the only sort of no-go areas, as it were, the three Ts, Taiwan,
Tibet, Tiananmen, and
Um,
now it's gone to a whole list.
yeah,
There's Xinjiang. Well,
Yeah.
Falun Gong was the original
well,
one.
yeah.
Yeah.
But there were only a handful of things that were kind of like no-go areas, and I could come on, or I could talk to a newspaper or whatever, and you could have an opinion, you could have a view on economic policy, what was happening with the RMB, on foreign investment laws, cybersecurity. That was all fairly contested space, as it were. But you fast forward a few years afterwards, and it had changed completely. So I think, by the time we got to sort of 2017, 18, around that sort of period, Chinese media became far more, it wasn't a contest of ideas in any way, shape or form anymore. Whereas earlier there was just some no-go areas. Yeah.
Yeah, the censorship would have been tighter in Chinese media
Yeah.
versus English media.
So just to cover a little bit of the period when you were in detention, we were having a discussion outside, and you said one of the things that happened to you was you were naked in a cage. This was one of the treatments of you.
And later, I made up a little bit of prose for the embassy to relate to my family, and it was, they put us in cages, but they're the animals. That sounds attention grabbing, but it's more complicated than that. I think the Chinese would always say, we fed you, you were clothed, you didn't feel the cold. This detention center is state of the art compared to the PSB detention centers. What are you complaining about? And different standards of humanity.
So what communication did you have with the outside world? I think you got books from Nick, and you got letters from other people. Did that make, how much?
That
did
came
make a difference?
after my trial, so more than a year after my actual arrest, and no period was easy, but I would say the first 6 months were probably the hardest. Yeah, because the contrast is so stark. And if you want to see what it was like, the artist Ai Weiwei did a series of sculptures called Sacred. That's exactly what he was like, except he got the deluxe suite because he's, princeling, and his cell had a desk and had a wardrobe. But the people watching you shit, shower, and sleep are the same.
Nick, can you tell us how it was for you? You were living in Beijing thinking everything's fine, then it wasn't.
Yeah. Ironically, it was my birthday. August 14 was when I figured out what had happened. One of Lei's friends phoned me and said she hadn't turned up to work, and actually then Jeff had called me as well. I guess it wasn't until the next day that sort of confirmed what had happened. At the start, it's frankly, you're just trying to crisis manage. Try to be practical. What can we do? Is there a way to help? What do we need to do at that point in time to help as much as possible? That's sort of all you're concerned about at that time. I didn't really think of anything else.
And there is this debate about quiet diplomacy and how much is you should be outspoken, even as journalists, people saying, well, maybe you better be careful what you write. Could you cause problems? I mean, from your situation, Nick, where do you see that argument?
Oh, there's no one size fits all to start with. I think in Li's case, I mean, it was quite diplomacy for a long time, right? And I think that's the right way to go initially. But I think there's probably a time to, if things aren't progressing, to make a little bit more noise. But it's got to be done in a very calculated, carefully managed way. And in Li's case, it certainly was. There was no surprises to anybody, and it was done in a particular way for a particular reason. It wasn't random. It wasn't, you know, an expression of frustration, because that's not helpful for the person being detained. So it's got to be done the right way. So in summary, there's not a one size fits all. Like, the only thing that I would say is that I've had it confirmed by enough people that when there's sort of really serious mistreatment going on, public, if you like, that can help, right? And there were at times when where that can help, but at the end of the day, it took the officials on our end and our political leaders to help to solve the problem, right? So, you've got to work with them.
One of the things that I want to point out is that for the Chinese cellmates, it's much worse because they don't have an outlet. They don't have a way to communicate to the outside world. And so there isn't that fear of embarrassment. And to this day, I feel a lot of grief that I cannot do more to help them. And and the anger that China treats its own people worse.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. At some point, there was the change of government, and I gather you felt that there was a change in the treatment of you?
I would say there were lots of little things, not just the treatment of me, but how friends' letters sounded in terms of how they engaged with the government, in terms of at the consular visits, the frequency of mentioning, Penny Wong would always tweet about me, and it brought a lot of solace.
Mm-hmm.
Here's this one woman who can help me, and she does on a regular basis.
And at what point did you learn that you were about to be released?
September 27th at the sentencing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I knew about a little bit earlier, but not much earlier.
Anyway, when you arrived back in Australia, I don't want to necessarily go into your personal situation, but what kind of Australia, you hadn't lived in Australia for a long time, what kind of Australia did you see in October last year?
Let's just say being released was like being reborn. And it's like for 3 years, I didn't have my name used. I was a number. I could only speak English for 30 minutes a month at the visits. So everything was coming at me. There was elation. There was almost being overwhelmed, emotionally, physically, and all throughout the past 8 months, I've been trying to fill that crater. What have I missed in those 3 years? What are the things I wanted to know about, the people I haven't seen, including some friends here tonight? And, go into a library, start crying. I used to pray for one book and there's thousands of them. People are blasé about it. go to a supermarket, stand there for half an hour looking at dairy, stuff of my dreams, hungry dreams.
Too many options, yeah. So,
But the Australia, yes, back to your question. So familiar and yet in many ways very different. For example, on air, I didn't know that the word Maori is now pronounced the Maori way. So I sort of apologized on air for that. And I came back, and days later, it was the referendum, the voice. So getting up to speed with that, what people were wearing. Yeah.
could I ask you to comment on the Albanese government's policy on China? I'll get you both to comment on that. I mean, how do you see Penny Wong as a foreign minister? And do you think the Albanese government is conducting its policy with China in the right way? If you were advising, what would you say?
Well, I love the fact that Penny Wong's tone is straight and respectful. She doesn't do attacks with anyone. And that is very rare in Aussie politics now.
I think it's just it's a contrast, and I think it's a bit more measured than what came before. I mean, in fairness, if you look at some of the decisions that the Morrison government then beforehand took in isolation, they might have been reasonable. I think where it was particularly problematic was how they were done, and the timing, and there was very little thought put into, well, it seemed to me anyway, what the impact would be. It wasn't very nuanced. It wasn't very professional in lots of ways. I can remember the call for the investigation into COVID, for example, was just handled so badly. And whereas I think the current government, and in vague fairness, I think the opposition that are there now wouldn't do things how they were done before when it comes to the engagement and communication in the bilateral relationship. So whilst there's probably not been substantive policy differences, there's definitely a change in tone. And it's been made easier because, of course, the Chinese side has wanted to repair relations, and there was a circuit break, as it were, with the new government for them to do that. So I think in general it's been good, but still got a way to go.
Do you have a view?
I've only seen what I've been able to see
Yeah.
in the past 8 months, and I think Penny Wong is a fantastic foreign minister. I would agree that what we've heard from Simon Birmingham is also in the right direction and the right tone. But as to strategic vision, how to deal with China, I think we're not there yet, or we're still confused, and it's still very reactive. Yeah, that's what I see.
I mean, Australia has a very strong trade relationship with China, as you both know, and the net exports were in fact 100 billion ahead in terms of our selling iron ore, beef, but obviously the other face of China is its expanding military presence, and the concern about that. I mean, how do we navigate these two sides of China, and what kind of strategic vision perhaps would it be good for Australia to adopt?
Read Jeff's book.
We've got to become adept at walking and chewing gum, and not overreact when issues and problems come up. In terms of, I mean, the obvious complementarity with the economies isn't going anywhere, and despite talk of trade diversification, that's not straightforward. It's not easy to do.
Yes.
So some
I've
acknowledgement.
read comments like when I was blocked from view at the Canberra press event, people saying we should stop trade with China because Chile was blocked. And yeah, and that sort of the extreme views that are held about China, the fear mongering, and the laziness to think and to read and really understand and engage with people whose views you don't agree with, that's really worrying.
Well, I think not trying to score political points out of every issue is going to help. You know,
Before coming back to Australia to live, I hadn't realized that the media landscape was so polarized. When I tell people I work at Sky, there's sometimes, it skips a beat. There's a pause.
Yes.
Like, what's a nice girl like you doing there? And I hate it because it's obvious they've just made that judgment without watching the news. They might have heard some of the commentary, but both sides are just looking at headlines and making judgment calls on that.
yeah, and I think our security agencies got a job to do. They need to be well funded. There's valid concerns. Make sure you've got good people do their job and do it quietly, which is what I kind of thought they were designed to do, and not make everything a political issue. And I think at times that's been problematic over the years. We've got good people we've got good diplomats, good people in those in our security agencies. Let's not politicize it and let them get on with their job.
The other thing I'm thinking of is that, yes, coercion exists, interference exists. It's existed since my dad's time. I remember during the 1989, Tiananmen Square protests, there would be, when we went on the streets in Melbourne to protest, there would be people from the Chinese consulate taking photos, or people from the student associations taking photos. And that's still happening. So can we reverse interfere? Can we export our soft power? Can each person who lives in Australia, whether they're Chinese, Malaysian, whatever heritage, can we be confident in our values? Can we embrace the best that this country has to offer, our value system that got me freed, the decency of Aussies? And can we tell that to people who have grown up under different value systems? So, to tell the Australian story, as it were.
Would you like to make a comment on how you see the media landscape both here and in China, and the coverage of China that you see in the media here? Obviously, two very different regimes and two very different media.
Well, it still saddens me that because of what happened to me, we now don't have any Aussie journos working for Aussie outlets in China. And I was joking to Peter Grester yesterday that if China wanted to show it was improving its journalistic freedom, it should invite me back to work there. And I would.
So, Nick, how do you see the Australian media coverage of China, and vice versa?
I'd make the same criticism of many topics, that it's far too binary. It's not very nuanced, and it's everything's good or bad. Everything's Darth Vader or Luke Skywalker. And
hug the panda or mug the panda.
Correct, and that's a frustration, right? And I mean, but it's not easy to, if you like, bring nuance into these difficult conversations. It's just not straightforward, right? So I'm not proposing that there's a magic solution to this problem either. I think it's,
if you go on to WeChat, sorry to
no, I was just going to say, I think it's up to all of us to try and, if you like, bring some nuance into those conversations.
If you go onto the Chinese internet, you think that China is going to take over the world. And if you go onto X, you think that CCP is going to collapse any minute now. And except for citizen journalism in China, the rest of Chinese journalism is so heavily censored um, that, yeah, that's definitely not the case 20, 15 years ago.
Well, I wanted to make one point too, Glenda, sorry, with the previous point we were talking about with things like foreign interference. One thing I wanted to say too, and some people in here will remember this, but if you go back to, if you like, the good old days, free trade negotiations, that sort of period, right? 12, 13, 14. Australian politicians were over in China. Half of them lived there, for God's sake. And in the Chinese system, getting a meeting with a senior minister was nigh on impossible. But if you were willing to donate a few dollars and buy a table at a fundraiser in Sydney, you could meet whoever you wanted to meet, right? And so, we were awfully open to our politicians, our senior public servants to a degree, who were a bit naive, were enormously open to influence, right? We've got to put it this way: we contributed to a degree as to how open we were and how easy it was to access our senior leaders. And sorry if there's any politicians in the room, they are rather open to the odd bit of flattery.
I don't think that's illegal.
Yeah, and
and other things.
Yeah, and a well-placed person who could help fund your party and was very good at flattery.
A promise
get a long
of
way.
entrepreneurial opportunities in
Well,
China
right.
after your retirement.
Yeah, so we were all of the above. I could name names and people. No, but no, joking. But we were enormously open to, right? So when foreign interference became a thing, as it were, I'm sure people in the system were concerned about it. But, back in those days, it was like, another Chinese business person coming and buying a table at my fundraiser and, wanting a few photos and, Mr. Wang was a nice chap, got plenty of cash, that one. That was happening all the time.
And in China, of course, pictures with officials or access to officials is so restricted that, they think it's the same all over the world.
So I'd like to discuss the role of the Chinese diaspora in Australia. We have 6% of our population is of Chinese descent. How do you see its role? And I think you were expressing in some of our conversations before a concern at the pressure on the Chinese diaspora in the sense of what the pressure that we put on them to perhaps choose.
Yeah, from schools to universities to workplaces. If you're from Hong Kong, if you're from Taiwan, if you're from the mainland, you might hold rather different views on China. Whereas I think 10, 15 years ago, they wouldn't be that different. You'd still cheer every Chinese athlete on at the Olympics. But now the taste has soured on that sort of broad patriotism, if you like. And when it comes to issues, if you want to be friends, it's best not to go touch those issues. And even with, I asked my daughter, and her school has a lot of people who are of Chinese heritage, and they have groups.
Do you have any thoughts on the role of the Chinese diaspora in Australia?
Well, it's just to continue building bridges, right? I think from a people-to-people perspective, from business perspective, but helping to keep driving that sort of understanding. I think it's very, very important.
Some people, sorry.
Yeah, but I'm just slightly worried that sometimes because our media can be so simplistic, that
that's your fault.
China, yeah, it's all my fault. China becomes a dirty word, and that might sometimes affect people who live here, people who have family and business interests and a great affection for China. And I just wish people would be less extreme.
Yeah, and look, we've got to acknowledge there's some wholly unsatisfactory things that China's been doing of recent times, right? But that doesn't have to colour everything, and that's something that gets lost here too, right? Yeah.
Yeah, like for the media, they'll have their go-to persons. This person is anti-China. I'll just interview this, but this person is pro-China. And you don't always get the full picture if you don't talk to people who can be quite, holistic in their views on China.
Everyone loves a bit of outrage.
One of the things that seems to be that was recognised, obviously you were not here, in the last election, was that the Morrison government's, I think, anti-China rhetoric cost it votes in Australia from the Chinese community here. I think there were a few seats that could have changed hands, or and I feel that the Liberal Party now, and I think they did a post-mortem, and I think they recognised that some of their rhetoric was costing them votes. So it'll be interesting to see perhaps how they approach the next election. And I think Peter Dutton, in some of his comments, has become a bit more nuanced.
Yeah, we were remarking on that the day of Li Qiang's visit.
Well, yeah, and I think there's also a realization that for all of the bluff and bluster and, we stared them down type rhetoric that government was on about, what did they achieve? Not much. And then the current government's had to spend time trying to get things back to where they were. So, yeah, okay, stood up for yourselves, that's great, but what did it actually achieve? And for all of the, if you like, yeah. So I think not only the numbers people working out, hey, probably pissing off a fairly large part of the community's not great electoral strategy. Also, it just wasn't very good policy in the end. It didn't work to achieve a great deal.
How important do you think that Li Qiang's visit was recently?
Oh, she couldn't see him, so she...
Yeah.
Very funny. As Nick said, we got things back to where they were. It's not exactly a great leap forward. Yeah, they were at pains to make this a diplomatic success. But I guess what happened to me was probably symbolic of the relationship. You can cover some of it up, but the facts remain. We have differences, but we will still engage and understand each other. And I wish more people knew about, or more Australians understood China, because right now you have just such an asymmetry, right? China knows a lot more about Australia. A lot more Chinese people know about Australia than the other way around. And we were talking about the new Colombo plan, which I actually hosted a function in Beijing to, for Julie Bishop, Foreign Minister at the time, to announce. And then it all fizzled out, unfortunately.
Yeah, Glenn, I don't think it means anything more than an indication that relations are back to somewhat of a normal level. I wouldn't overstate the importance of the visit or anything that came out of it, other than it's hopefully an indication that it's more a normalized relationship. That's about all it means, I think.
I was talking to John Garno, and he said, what does Li Qiang mean by shelving the differences? Differences are the relationship.
So how was it for you that day? I mean, we all saw you. You handled the situation with a lot of grace. But were you surprised at what happened to you?
I expected them to be concerned. I did not expect them to throw caution to the wind in a room full of journalists and do what they did at such a serious, formal event. But then going over that day, it's not that shocking either.
Mm.
Yeah, as Jeff's great quote puts it beautifully, it's all about face, but often there's no shame.
Well, I can remember we were chatting the night before about, like, if you got a question, what would the question be? And Lay and I were chatting the night before about it, and neither of us. It's not like Lay said, "Oh, I wonder if there'll be any, issues with me being there tomorrow, or anything like that." And never didn't cross our minds really.
But I did think of one angle where, which prompted them to not want me to appear in the shot, which is if I can be at such an event, because to the Chinese, for a journalist to cover such an event, you have to be, vetted, and it's quite a privilege. And maybe it would give off the signal that, what does it say about my crime, my supposed crime, and the system that convicted me?
We'll go to questions in about 5 minutes' time. Can I just ask you, Nick, about the Australian trade with China? There was a lot of discussion about, should we be trading with China? There's obviously a lot of benefits, but, how do you reconcile that with the other faces of China? And how do you see also the Chinese sort of sanctions on some of the trade, and then the unwinding of it? And where do you see perhaps things going from here in terms of the trade?
Oh, hopefully it's more normalised. I mean, I think to a degree we're getting to diminishing returns in terms of how many more businesses could sort of, if you like, get into the China market. And I think even by the time we got to sort of 17, 18, 19, that sort of period, I would probably have discouraged more Australian companies from coming into the Chinese market than encouraged in some ways, because you got to be ready, right? It's not an easy market. It's hugely competitive. So I think from a trade perspective, I would have thought, we're just going to see it continue. Whether there's any, I wouldn't imagine. Some companies are going to be concerned that the rug can get pulled out from underneath them again. Some of the wine companies, for example, might be a little bit more cautious than they were.
But they also tried to diversify into other markets and found that wasn't so easy, and China is still very lucrative.
Well, I remember talking to some wine companies years ago saying, why aren't you investing into the local wine market? The French were.
Yes.
And that's a pretty good hedge as well against these sorts of things. But why our industry didn't also look at those things, I don't quite know, because I think they should have. What's that?
More difficult.
Yeah, but, for example, a company like Treasury, was such a big part of their market, why they weren't more invested in there other than just, selling vino, I don't quite understand, to be honest. They should have been, frankly. So, yeah, I mean, I see, certainly positive signs. But we won't go back to where it was in terms of business being as optimistic, because there will be caution. But as I said, there's a big part of that's diminishing returns. It's a hard market. I still go back to that all the time. I still go, it's hugely competitive. It's every good company in the world is trying to bring whatever they're good at to China and sell it and market it.
And I wonder what role China will be allowed to play in our future Made in Australia plan.
That's
given green energy is China's forte at the moment.
I'm just going to ask a few more questions, then throw it open to people in the room. Taiwan, what do you think will happen there?
I've heard she wants to attack by 27. I've heard the Taiwanese, the local Taiwanese who, aren't in politics, are pretty defeatist about it. And yeah, I've also heard that the glorious ambiguity may continue. So all these are moving pieces.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, others will have good opinions on this, but I just sort of look at it and go, unless there's some existential crisis in China where it threatens the legitimacy of the party, then I would have thought the option of doing something forcefully, the calculation is it's just far too risky. Because let's assume for a moment they tried to launch some sort of forceful action and it didn't work. Where does that leave the leadership? Where does that leave the party? Nowhere very good. So I don't know. I don't think the chances are very high that anything will happen in the near term.
And the word about what's happening in China's defense forces is it's a mess. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you ask ordinary Chinese people who have been brainwashed, including myself when I was in primary school in China, is Taiwan part of China? I think most will probably say yes. But if you ask, should we take over, should China overtake or take over Taiwan by military means, I think you'll get a much smaller number.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'd just like to open the floor up for questions. I've got many more, but anyone like to ask a question? If you could just wait for the microphone, thank you.
Eric here from the SMH. Good to see you both. It strikes me that both of you, out of most anyone in Australia, would have cause to feel aggrieved by what the Chinese government has done to you. And yet, I don't get a sense of that from your comments. And indeed, that bitterness, if there is any, is mostly reserved for the Ministry of State Security, your treatment by particular officials, but not for the Chinese government as a whole, or perhaps rather the Chinese people and the country as a whole. How hard was that to maintain, I guess, a sense of optimism in the face of like extraordinary challenges that I imagine many in Australia could not even comprehend?
I was asked if I would go back to China, like 2 months after I came back, and nowadays my stock answer is yes, if I felt safe enough, and yes, if I felt welcome enough, and those two conditions have to be met. But when it comes to China, it just evokes so many feelings in me because I'm a very sentimental person, and China represents so much, right? And we all have hopes for people to get along, for beauty to be appreciated. And the whole concept of nations is fiction anyway. So what is China? And I can only, I guess, separate them into different parts. For example, when I first came back, Nick tried to buy onions, and I said, "Oh no, I've got PTSD because there would be this awful onion stew on Wednesday nights that would just the whole cell would reek." But what I'm trying to say is that at any given point in time, anything that represents China you might feel differently about. So it's a very complicated, and ask any Chinese person living in Australia. There are things that they miss intensely, that they long for, that they try to replicate here. And there are things that they hate and want to escape. And it's all a matter of calculus. But I used to be, I guess, branded as part of the China. Oh, I didn't agree with it, but anyone who works for the state media is branded as a China cheerleader. But I thought I saw the other side as well. But the past 3 years, I have felt the other side, and it's not good. So In fact, when I found out I would be coming back to Australia, I said to Ambassador Fletcher something like, if there was a war right now, I'd go and fight for Australia. And every day I'm reminded of the differences and how we should speak up and be proud of those differences in freedom. Because if we don't, if we start to surrender, we're all seduced by the glossier parts of China, then one day we'll be, in prisons of the mind without even knowing it.
Well, I'll be far less profound, but no. I think from my perspective, I don't find it difficult to separate it, right? Purely because I think in the context of what I used to do over there, I would deal with people from various government departments. And I'm just, to be honest with you, those conversations, whether it was talking about economic policy and opening up, and what the government could be doing on tax policy or, movement of people, or crapping on about the NBA or the EPL or whatever. I could be having a normal conversation if I was talking to a bureaucrat from Canberra about policy here. And so I guess I got to know people within the government system who were just people doing their job. And we had a pretty similar outlook on things. So you kind of started to, so when horribly unfair things happened, for
It
me,
doesn't change all that. Right?
no. Well, there's
People are still people.
correct, and it autocratic systems who have a need to control everything. But there's going to be victims in that process, and that's exactly what Lei was. But at an individual level, there's just people trying to live their life and do their job to the best of their ability and feed their family and have a holiday every year and get on with life as much as any of us here in the room would try and do, right? So, and I guess,
I think demonizing is not the way to go.
No, and I think look, I grew up in a place like PNG where I'm back there now, and 40 years later, you still got 80% of the population don't have access to power, and it teaches you when you grow up in different countries to realize that we all kind of want the same thing, and there's relatively equal parts good people, assholes, funny people, whatever. Wherever you go, they seem to be in roughly the same proportion. Not in this room, of course.
And my motto is be better, not bitter.
That's amazing. Any other questions from the floor?
One of the Andrew Jakubowicz from UTS, I guess. One of the things that I tried to work out when all that stuff happened to you, because you described it as everything was going fine, you were on the top of the world, and then suddenly you worked. Do you have a sense of what the logic was of what happened to you from the other side? Is there a narrative, a cohesive, coherent, and comprehensible narrative of the Chinese side that you could go, when it happened to you, said, oh yeah, I get that? Or was this just, this is nuts, this is horrific?
Nobody's going to tell you the logic. You can only try to figure it out yourself, and nobody's going to admit or deny anything. Laws are being weaponized in autocratic regimes to legitimize anything. And there's a Chinese saying that says, if the emperor says you have a crime, you have a crime.
I know all I'd add is that no, there was never any indication given as to why and what from the outside either. So it was a guessing game, and it remained that for a long time to try and put certain strands together to come up with perhaps an explanation, which is probably something we can talk about another time. But yeah, there wasn't any indication given, no.
James?
Suffice to say, some of my posts about what was happening during COVID, while not the reason, wouldn't have gone down well.
I think you were quite critical of their handling of COVID.
Who wasn't?
But James, are there any questions coming in from the online audience?
Yeah, thanks, Glenda. There are a couple. And I should also just encourage our online audience to keep submitting questions. I understand, I think some of my introduction there was a technical issue, so our online audience may not have heard it all. So please send in your questions. Here's one. It's a bit of an unfair question, but I'll put it to you anyway because I'm sure you both often get asked it. And essentially the question is, look, given more recent changes in China's national security legislation and their incredibly broad definition of national security, what advice do you think universities should be giving to academic staff travelling to China around the risks of arbitrary detention? Now, I know no one can give a black or white answer to that, but any thoughts on that?
I'd always go back to it if it was a business, the same thing. The Boy Scout, be prepared, get good advice, and approach it like anything else. You've got risks to manage those risks and make a judgment call. I don't think it's super complicated in that sense. But yeah, good advice and make a sound decision based on the best information you can get.
I mean, who's going to believe advice from me, right? But having seen what can be classified as a state secret, I'm not super confident in saying where the red lines are anymore. I used to be, but I was devastatingly wrong. And I mean, one can only hope that because relations are back on track and because of the huge disincentive of locking me up, maybe, there'll be more caution going forward.
Just one more question, Glenda.
And sorry, and in fact, that is what some recent what we're trying to do with AWADA, the Australian Wrongful Arbitrary Detention Alliance, are trying to do, is ultimately to deter, to make it clear it is not worth your while to play human chess.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you wrote recently that really struck me, if I can just quote you here, you wrote an op-ed for Sky News recently, and you said, quote, "I am very much a shades of grey person." And you went on to say, "I do not like the feeling I am fodder for China hawks or an unfortunate existence for China doves," close quote. Now, of course, there are folks on ends of the spectrum who see things very much in black and white terms. Do you engage with those folks? And if so, how? And I'm probably asking a broader question. What's your advice for all of us who are engaged in Australia's public debate on China? Do you see value in taking on those voices at the extreme, or are they best just ignored?
I think we should discuss our differences rationally. I think we should first agree on the facts. I think a China hawk would still agree that China is our biggest customer. I think a China dove would still agree that some of China's behavior is belligerent. And instead of labeling and canceling people and the whole echo chamber phenomenon, why can't we have more intelligent discourse on what we disagree on? I'd like to see newspapers not labeled as left or right. I'd like to see commentators who are not always about the same view and get the same guests on.
Yeah, I think it's just about, it's pretty hard to have a rational conversation with people who are lazy and stupid when it comes to these issues, where you're completely extreme on one side or the other. That you start to get into what's the point, right? It's a bit like, I'm a West Tigers fan and we suck. And, I'm completely one-eyed and I'll never believe anything other than, yes, next year's our year. It's okay to be like that with your footy team, but when it comes to these sorts of issues, I think if you're completely one-eyed and you're extreme on either end, it's a combination of being pretty lazy, and then also, um, you know, probably just spoiling for a fight half the time, right?
Mm. Glenda, back to you. I've got a couple more questions, but I'll go back to you first.
Okay. Are there any questions from the floor? No? Okay.
Okay.
You sure? No. Okay. Well, I've got some more questions for you. What is the mood inside China in terms of economically? But also we hear about this phenomenon of lying flat. We hear a very high unemployment rate with the youth. And maybe it suits us externally to think that, the youth of China is disaffected. What do you think of the discussion about lying flat? And what do you think is the views of perhaps young people in China today?
Well, I had a new cellmate who was fairly young, and because she came in rather late, and we were so desperate for information, we asked her what was happening, and she was definitely echoing the lying flat and the pessimism, and that's mostly out of COVID and also out of the trade war, um, and out of extreme regulatory um, restrictions. And it's very hard to actually understand exactly what's going on in China because it's so huge and multifaceted. And depending on who you talk to, it can be any of a number of things. You can talk it up or down any of a number of notches. But definitely compared to a few years ago, there's a lot more pessimism and hence, property sales being very low in turnover, and people not spending money, not splashing as much as they used to, and just not really understanding where China is going. I think that's where the lying flat comes from. Whereas I think 10, 15 years ago, um, it was very clear. You became a civil servant or you went overseas to study or you joined a multinational or you founded your own tech company, and they were sort of the four main roads to a good life. And now all those four routes all have question marks on them.
What do you get the sense of the mood in China at the moment?
Oh, it's hard because I've been away for a while, but I think, I think there was a bit of a realization through COVID and particularly how China opened back up after COVID that the government didn't have all the solutions. So I think that's something that's interesting to observe. And I think the current situation, I would never in a million years discount China's capacity, its entrepreneurial ability, to get through most things. And at the moment, yes, we've got this situation where you've got a government who's trying its best to reassert control and centralize and manage everything as tightly as possible. And that's going to be a tussle that's going to continue for some time. And perhaps when there's a new direction from the leadership, we'll see that entrepreneurial spirit and that engine restart and move pretty quickly again. But how long is that going to take? Don't know. What shape might it take? Don't know. And we're probably in for a relatively flat period, I think, for a while. It's not that, and it won't be that. It'll probably be a bit flat for some time, I suspect.
Jeff, I think you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Glenda. Congratulations on a fantastic talk, guys. It's really superb. I've just been in China not so long ago, and my feeling is that the commentary from outside of China compared to what you see on the ground, and remembering Lei, you haven't seen China on the ground for quite a long time now. It's almost like parallel universes. And to your point, Nick, about entrepreneurship, you don't go from nothing to dominating the world's EV market in 5 years. Something's going on. I'm not sure I understand it necessarily, but something is really happening. And there's a lot of very dynamic elements.
What was it about the Daimler CEO at the Shanghai Auto Show saying, we've just had our Nokia moment?
Really? Yes. Well, and I think that's the intention, absolutely. So my point really, though, is, for nearly 40 years of involvement with China and working on the Chinese economy and trying to explain it to people, the big challenge is always to keep up with the contemporary reality of China. Because as you said, Lei, it's so big, it's so complex, it's so vast, and it changes so quickly. And it is unbelievable to me that we do not have any journalists on the ground. It's only through a media presence on the ground that you can hope to begin to catch up with the contemporary reality. So the fact that so much public discussion here on China it bears little resemblance to the reality of what's happening inside China. I don't know if you have any sense of when Australian journalists might return to
Eric?
China. Or
Gonna say.
I'm doing your pleading for you.
As an exile, to help as an exiled journalist, not anytime soon. And the reason is perhaps threefold. One is that despite certainly my application, which was held up for many years and has never progressed and was finally denied on the Chinese side, not being interested in having Australian journalists, despite saying publicly that they are, that's the first hurdle. The second hurdle is that, if we're honest, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Australian security agencies are also not that keen on Australian journalists being in China. And without support from the Australian government saying, yes, we think it's time to go, then publications are also reluctant to send journalists back into China. And of course, the great case study and symbol of all this and the risk of it is right in front of us. And I think that is a powerful reminder. So it's going to take time. And I think patience sort of from all sides, whether it's the publications, the government, and readers, unfortunately, for there to be a new normal in that situation where people feel comfortable. And I doubt very much until we get sustained lobbying from the Australian government, and it becomes a top order priority to get journalists back in. And maybe once the trade impediments are reduced, then we might start to see some solutions. It was not until the US really started lobbying that we started to see some movement on their visas, and even they are on the go slow. The British are also have only just had another correspondent approved for the BBC. So everyone around the world is facing those hurdles, and Australia is right at the pointy end of those.
But didn't PM Albanese say 2 weeks ago in Canberra that there were no visa impediments?
I think that's on the advice of the Chinese government, which says, yes, of course they're welcome to apply. But then how long do you wait for your application to go through only for it to be denied? So everyone's saying, yes, we'd love to have you, but the reality is very different. And I think the first port of call there is on the Chinese side to get those applications through.
Well, it's up there with, sending some lowly ranked embassy officials to stand in front of journalists for own goals, right? I mean, it's so stupid to not want to encourage having Western journalists in China reporting, to Jeff's point, right? I mean, in my old role, I would see a lot of journalists come in. I remember Glenda when you first came, right? And you see their change over time as to what their preconceived ideas of what China was, and then how their stories about the market changed over time with their perceptions, and the fact that, whether it's yourself or Will or Bill or who for some time with ABC and his replacement have got to do it from Singapore or Taiwan or whatever. There's no substitute, right? And it's just monumentally stupid from the Chinese side to allow this to continue. So if I'm the Chinese side, I'd be saying to the Australian government, what do you need? What assurances can we give? Let's get your people back there because it's good for everybody. Yeah.
think that we're out of time. In fact, a little bit over time. So I'll hand it back to you, James. But thank you so much. It's been a very interesting discussion, and thank you for being so frank.
Yeah.
Can I just say very quickly, as somebody who used to do this sort of event all the time, thank you to ACRI, to James, to everyone coming. I know how much work goes into these things. So to
Thank
your
you,
staff
Amy.
and your volunteers and everybody, thank you.
And thanks to everyone for coming.
Thanks, Lei, Nick, and Glenda. Look, that was a real masterclass in Australia-China relations, and I really appreciate it because I know when you, as I said to you before, when you folks speak about this, it's not just as an observer. It's, you know, from having been in the thick of it in both the highs and the very, very lows. Folks, just a reminder that the recording and the transcript of tonight's event will be online, and with our fabulous events manager, Amy Ma, you can be sure that that will be up sooner rather than later. To our audience, thank you for coming, to both our in-person and our online audience. We look forward to welcoming you back to another UTS ACRI event in the near future, although it's going to be pretty hard to put on another event that's going to match this one in terms of the insight that's been delivered. Thank you all once again. Thank you, audience, for coming. Good night.